Right. This is for Stacey Lee's model minority stereotype. By the end, I want you guys to be able to define this in your own words. What is the model minority? Talk a little bit about ethnographic, be able to talk about ethnographic research. And then it'll be important for you guys to know kind of the framework here for voluntary and involuntary minorities. Um, and then in the second part, kind of what we'll do is we'll go over Stacey Lee's kind of research and the categories of Asian students that she examined. And one of the core things here is that while this focuses on Asian American students, it's something that I think extends beyond that. That it's we'll come back to this at the end, but often used against other groups. The idea often is, well, if Asian Americans can come here and be successful, then it's just sort of about your attitude and your work ethic and not about other factors in schools. And what we'll see is that the kind of the myth or idea around Asian students um, is far more complicated than it's often made out to be. I often in class I just have students try to brainstorm how many countries they can think of that are Asian in the continent of Asia. Um, and there's some that come to mind immediately, like China, Japan, Korea, the South, North and South Korea. And then most students, if they have time, they'll kind of push into um, Southeast Asian countries, the Philippines, Indonesia, or Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, things like that. But also, what people fail to think about or realize is India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, um, parts of the former Soviet Union, Mongolia, things like that are all part of the Asian continent. I can just tell you from spending time in Pakistan, Afghanistan, in India as well, you see, the kind of elements of the Confucianism and other traditionally kind of like Asian influences. Um, I would just say point out like it's just different areas were colonized, and then different religious groups kind of conquered and spread religion to different areas. So you get like different dynamics um, in the different countries, but still like some underlying similarities. And I just like to point that out that when we talk about Asian Americans or Asians, we're talking about a very diverse group of people. In the U.S., you can kind of see demographics or concentrations of Asian Americans in different areas, and in Indiana, in particular, different pockets of Asian Americans. What I want to do, and I think what's important to our story here, is to differentiate to the different. A key factor is immigration, how people immigrated to the U.S. when, and the different dynamics. And I want to point out that we have a southeastern Asian population throughout the United States and in Indiana as well. And a lot of times, these groups came to uh, the U.S. through with refugee status. So, for example, in Wisconsin, Minnesota, groups of the Hmong, and in Indiana, we have a large Burmese refugee population, both in Fort Wayne and in Indianapolis. So it's something relevant to the state. But on the other hand, the other groups, Japanese, Chinese Americans, have kind of enjoyed favorable immigration status after World War II. Of course, Japanese and Chinese were discriminated against significantly. Japanese internment around World War II, the Chinese through the 1800s and the Opium Wars, uh, horribly discriminated against. But around the 1970s, with a shift in policy, you get a major influx of upper middle class, wealthy Japanese and Chinese Americans, and that's continued today. And that means, to put that into context with Indiana, you're going to have a very different kind of Asian population. Again, I'm speaking in generalities, but in places like Bloomington or West Lafayette, where you have Purdue, and where you have basically Asian students a lot of times coming for higher education, upper middle class families, that's going to be very different than the conditions or situation that the Burmese population found themselves in Fort Wayne and in Indianapolis. I'm not just there's a lot of ignorance a lot of times. That came up when Miss America was Indian. Jeremy Lin, this is kind of dated now, but with his basketball career, a lot of discrimination. He's the first Asian American in the NBA. Um, this segment happened a few years ago, and it was just through Chinatown, and it was a pretty, it was, I mean, it was a pretty jarring, but a lot of like sort of stereotypes and just discrimination and sort of mocking of people, which I think happens a lot. And that's one of the things, the issues I think with the model minority, is that I think people think that because there's a lot of positive stereotypes with Asian Americans, they can get away with making very derogatory ones. And our Ball State student president had stepped down a few years ago because he had tweeted out a bunch of derogatory comments, and that's happened at IU and a number of other schools where the class presidents or certain people just make derogatory comments. So I mean, generally speaking, the model minority is that Asian Americans are kind of almost universally successful because they're hardworking and come from a culture that values education. And there's other things that kind of go along with it, good at math, things like that. But the general model minority stereotype is universally successful um, because of cultural factors. Um, Asians are actually a growing population in the United States. And I've kind of differentiated here. I think I have different groups. Um, Now again, Southeast Asians, the Hmong, for example, to give you another example, were ethnic minority in Cambodia. They sided with the United States during the Vietnam War, and then they were at risk of being slaughtered. I mean, just being killed in a kind of genocide. And America did the right thing. We offered refuge to the Hmong and relocated large numbers to the U.S. And they faced a lot of discrimination and political backlash. And I'll just point out the Cambodians too as well. There was a genocide and a lot. California has a large Cambodian population, and in those parts of Los Angeles where you get a lot of former Cambodian refugees, you get drugs, gang violence, all the things with any group that lives in a high poverty concentration with limited opportunity. Same with the Hmong. If you've ever seen the movie Green Torino with Clint Eastwood, in that movie, the backdrop are the Hmong refugees. Um, so yeah, issues. And there's an interesting piece. I don't think I shared it with you guys, but they talk a lot about how groups who were refugees, oftentimes, even the children who maybe didn't experience the first, like in Cambodia, the genocide or the camps and different things, but the experience what's called generational trauma, kind of anxiety and different psychological effects that coming from having parents who've gone through those issues. The media has done a lot to promote the model minority stereotype. These are the covers that were referenced in the reading. And I think that even if you look at them, while they maybe on a certain level seem like they're meant to be complementary, they have an underlying kind of just discriminatory element. This is sort of how through the 20th century the Asian people were, and often Chinese were depicted as vermin, invasive, those kinds of things. So ethnographic research, again, something I wanted you to know because that's the study that Lee conducted. It's comprised of basically immersing yourself. It's a subset of anthropology, immersing yourself in a culture. Stacy Lee was at the school that she studied for over a year, interviewed, a significant number of students, teachers, took field notes, did surveys. So it's a very kind of immersive, connected form of research. And the phrase that I think stands out too that I really like is the story behind the numbers. The story behind the numbers. Statistics give you one kind of information. If you want to know, more about it, then you have to kind of do other forms of research. Um, so John Ogbu is a famous anthropologist, and he developed this theory of voluntary, involuntary minorities. Voluntary minority in his eyes, are people who come here under, willingly. They migrate here under their own sort of accord. And he says that basically these groups they face discrimination, but they're more willing to tolerate it. They view themselves as guests, and they still see education as a pathway to a better life. Involuntary minorities, and for voluntary minority, he gives the example of Asians. Involuntary minority would be people who came here through conquest or through slavery. So African Americans, and he puts into this category Mexican Americans and Hawaiians, because we, colonized Hawaii. So he says that this group has kind of an oppositional framework a lot of times, and views education as sort of robbing them of their cultural identity, and so do not see it as a pathway to future success. His work's kind of interesting. I've seen ethnographies of schools where he talks about how, like African American kids a lot of times want to be rappers or sports stars because they can maintain their cultural identity while still being successful. Certain things like that. But it's important to know that Stacey Lee's book and the piece you read is a challenge. She's challenging or wants to push back against Agbu. One of the things though that's key is that, and I'll come back to this, but where both Lee and Agbu agree is that a student's success in school is related to their perception of future success. So, and I think that's incredibly powerful for teachers. If you can get a kid to believe that their education is a pathway to a better life, they're willing to endure aspects of it that are challenging or they don't like. They're more willing to engage and get through it. And I think probably all of us, know that from firsthand experience, right? All right. So the four groups of people here, five groups she lays out. Korean, they identify as Korean. I want you to remember they kind of develop a strategy of accommodation without assimilation. Um, so they don't. What she claims is they don't fully assimilate. They value education, family, struggle with things like language and discrimination, and yeah. So okay, high achievers. The rest, I think these two basically have Pan-Asian, which he calls a Pan-Asian identity, meaning all just kind of like a general sort of Asian identity. High achievers value family, education, hard work. Um, uh, Challenges would be things like language again, pressure to conform, other demands. To give you an idea of the language, there's the one kid who uh, wants to go into politics or to be a lawyer and decides, and whose mother pressures him to be an engineer because she thinks that his accent would hold him back in those other fields. Low achievers, Pan-Asian identity, value family, hard work, education, all the same. The implicit message here is, look, that both high achievers and low achievers are the same values, same backgrounds. I mean, a lot of the same dynamics. The issue is just one is making it and one is struggling. The only other challenge that I would add over here, they have all the other ones, the pressure, these things, is that this group has problems and issues that go unnoticed by teachers and others. And there's an example of a kid who's failing a class and and is asked to be a peer mentor for that subject. Because again, it's hard for people to not see these students through the lens of the model minority. New waivers you don't need to know much about. I mean, I would just say as a generalization, this is a group that I think rejects and goes against anything associated with the model minorities, with the stereotypes that people have against Asians. So if people think Asians are non-combative, this group values getting in fights, brags about not doing well in school, brags against not having a strong work ethic, all these kinds of things. So I think this is just a group that I think has decided to really rebel against the stereotypes. Asian Americans is a group that their primary issue was struggling against racism and discrimination, and really wanted to kind of pursue, education as a way to fight back against discrimination. Um, And I would just point out again that that's one of the things is a major issue is for teachers to just kind of get to know students on a personal level, and that idea of not overlooking students or not seeing students through the lens of a kind of stereotype. So Lee basically rejects, not fully rejects, but at least counters his analysis and thinks that his model of the model involuntary minority fails to explain why Asians do not perform well in their countries of origin. So, for example, in China, not all students are obviously universally successful. There's a lot of challenges in the education system. Um, it fails to explain poor achievement among Asian Americans, and then again treats this group as a homogeneous group and ignores differences. So, and again, to give you an example, and this is cited in one of the videos that I often use in class, but Southeast Asian students actually have a higher dropout rate than African Americans and Hispanics. So again, when you when you look at Asians, there are some positive signs in terms of educational attainment, but when you disaggregate that data, what you see are a much more complex kind of portrait. And on the other counter to that, for many years, I don't know if it's still the same, but for many years, the highest performing group in terms of immigrant group, the highest performing immigrant group in terms of higher education were African students. African students perform incredibly well here in higher education. So she tells us again that the model minority stereotype is dangerous, even though it can seem you know positive on the surface. Underlying, it's dangerous. It's silencing